Last part of day one of the program. And now we're going to have 3 short presentations followed by a panel debate. And this session here is going to be led by David Pinder. So I'll just give the word to you.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to have the 3 presentations, as mentioned, and then we'll have a discussion. So the first presentation is from Peter Bengtsen, who is based at the University of Lund in the Department of Arts and Cultural Sciences as an art historian and sociologist with a long-standing interest in street art. And among publications is a book, The Street Art World, that came out a couple of years ago, and is also getting interested in questions of eco-criticism. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? I think you. Yeah, so David said my name is Peter Bengtsen, and great pronunciation, by the way. People usually struggle with that. I am an art historian and sociologist based at Lund University in Sweden, and I've been writing about street art since 2006. Been interested in it a fair bit longer than that, but I started my academic work on it in 2006, and in 2014 I published the book that you see on the screen here called The Street Art World. That was my first book, and I'm currently working on my second book, which is about street art and eco-criticism, or street art in the environment. In my talk today, I'm not going to be focusing so much on street art per se. I'm rather going to be talking more generally about the right to the city, since this is the theme of this panel. And I'm also going to try to relate the issues of the right to the city to a concept called spatial justice, which is a concept taken from critical legal theory. So to start out, I would like to show you a short video that discusses the ongoing privatization of public space, which Kenneth Phillips were also touching upon in the previous presentation. See if we can get it to work.
I'm here outside one of London's most famous buildings. It's St Paul's Cathedral. Sorry, what? Problem with sound. Again. Need to get a new sound man, Tim, don't you? Where was I? Yeah, so she's using EU nationals as pawns in her Brexit negotiations. That's 3 million people living in this country who are shitting themselves that they're going to be deported, so she's got a stronger case for Brits living abroad. She's treating Brexit as if, you know, it's some sort of hostage negotiation situation. Even Michael Gove wouldn't have done this. UKIP ruled it out. Think about that. Theresa May has a stricter immigration policy than UKIP. You know, sorry, what?
Got a permit.
A permit? Yeah, Tim, have we got a permit? Yeah? Just give us a... Oh, you fucking twat! Not you. You just... Do we need a permit?
I'm asking you if you need a permit.
Well, it's yes. Fucking... Oh, sorry, it's fucking St Paul's Cathedral. Tim, we need a permit, okay? Can you just give us a second, okay? Do you know this area, the City of London, 95% of it is privately owned property. Occupy London did a protest here a few years ago because it was the only public space left in the area, and now obviously that's been sold off as well. Someone somewhere is privatising my general surroundings without my permission. They're selling off public land, public spaces, giving it to massive corporations. All these people here, they don't realise that they're walking on private property and that they could be removed at any moment for any reason whatsoever. Well, we're going to have to go somewhere else then, aren't we, Tim, you fucking dick? Do you know much about human rights? Human rights, it's the basics: right to clean water, right not to go hungry, right to a decent meal, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, basic human rights. But here's the thing, right? Human rights don't apply on private property. Rule of law applies, but not human rights. So 95% of this area, I don't actually have any human rights. The freedom of speech, freedom of expression, right to a decent meal. Round here, you're fucking kidding me, aren't you? If I have to have another fucking tuna sandwich from Pret a Manger, I'm going to fucking shoot myself. I'm sorry, it's just, you know, I'm not even allowed to fucking film here, am I? We're going to have to go somewhere else, Tim. I'm not even allowed to film it. Do you know what I'm filming, mate? The news. I'm not even allowed to report the news in the City of London, one of London's biggest financial districts, okay? And I'm not allowed to say what I think and report what I see, because if I do, I'm likely to be escorted off the premises. And in this particular instance, the premises is the middle of the fucking street. I'm not having a go at you, mate. I'm having a go at you. Should have got a permit, Tim, shouldn't we? Need to find a fucking studio with a green screen, just make shit up. All right, we're going. We're going. Okay.
All right, so what you've seen here, some of you may know this character already. It's a character named Jonathan Pye, and he's a fake news reporter. It's actually a character created by the British comedian Tom Walker. And there's a bunch of videos up on YouTube that you can watch where he talks about current events and current themes. So in this video, Walker raises some quite interesting points, I feel, about the privatization of public space. I should point out that legally speaking, human rights do actually apply on private property. So what Walker is saying in the video is not accurate. But having said that, a right such as the right to free assembly is dependent on the existence of public spaces where people can legally assemble, or alternatively the consent of the owner of some property to assemble on that private property. And this, of course, makes sense in the content of private property like our homes. Most of us probably wouldn't be too happy if an arbitrary group of random people insisted on holding weekly meetings in our kitchen, based on the right to free assembly. However, things become more problematic when property owners exercise their right to turn away people from so-called publicly accessible spaces, which is to say spaces that may appear to be public, but that are in fact privately owned. So as ethnographer Bradley L. Garrett has pointed out in The Guardian back in 2015, one problem with privately owned public spaces is that they often feel and also frequently are heavily monitored and controlled. And this inhibits people's de facto ability to express themselves freely and use and engage with the space. Garrett writes that when space is controlled, and especially when the public is unclear about what the legal and acceptable boundaries of activity are, we tend to police ourselves and to monitor our behavior and so on, especially to avoid embarrassing confrontations with security, like the one that we just saw in the video, which obviously was a fake encounter. It was a staged encounter, but it's an apt illustration of what might happen if you act in a way that is perceived to be inappropriate in a publicly accessible space. So I would add to Garrett's observation that this sort of behavior modification that will take place in publicly accessible spaces is not only prevalent in these privately owned spaces. Since the extent of privately owned public spaces is not systematically mapped out, it's often not clear whether or not the space that we find ourselves in when we are in the city is in fact public space or simply publicly accessible space. And with the increasing privatization of public space, it seems very likely that there will be a kind of a bleed-over effect, and that we may also increasingly behave as if we were in a publicly accessible space, even when we are in fact in a public space, just to be safe and just to avoid confrontation. So how can we respond to the increasing privatization of public space, which diminishes our de facto right to the city? Well, according to Garrett, a first step would be to start systematically mapping out and using these public spaces to raise awareness about what we have, what spaces we have available to us before we lose them. And one way to do this is to subvert private space basically by undertaking public acts without permission in order to see what happens. So stage a picnic in a public square or a seemingly public square and see what happens. throw a festival or start playing music or do a dance routine or something and see if you're removed. And then after that, you have to also map this down. What Garrett points out is that if information about public space, where it is and what we can do in it, is not clear, then small acts like the ones I just mentioned can reveal what is and is not possible, and then we can map this down. And that can be the basis for figuring out different strategies on how to relate to these spaces and how to perhaps claim some of these spaces back. It's important to note that this type of mapping is not something that is just going to happen on its own. It requires a public that's willing to participate and actively use public spaces or seemingly public spaces, and then also are willing to record and share the results of these experiments that they're conducting. So, from an academic point of view, the actions suggested by Garrett find support in the notion of spatial justice. And spatial justice, as I mentioned before, is a term that is borrowed from critical legal theory. And as the name suggests, for spatial justice, focus is on what is just rather than what is legal. And these are two concepts within legal studies that are often at odds with one another. So justice and legality. Fundamentally, spatial justice is based on the realization that a certain space can only be occupied by one body at a time. So if somebody's sitting in a chair here in the audience, nobody else can sit in that chair unless the person moves. The space is already occupied. So the principle of spatial justice is that we need to shift between taking up space and withdrawing from that space to let others claim it, with the understanding that they will also in turn withdraw and allow us to reclaim the space again. As such, spatial justice stands in opposition to legal claims to the permanent appropriation of space, for instance, through property law and private ownership. And here it can be noted that ephemeral street artworks, which of course is relevant within the context we find ourselves in at the moment, can be seen as an expression of spatial justice since they make no permanent claim to the space that they occupy. An artist makes the work with an understanding that it will have to withdraw in the face of a legal claim or another artist's work, perhaps, but also with the understanding that the artist can then go back and reclaim the space again. Spatial justice, then, is a concept that lends itself to Garrett's strategy for challenging the publicness of public space. But it's important to note that spatial justice is an idea and an ideal. Like utopia, which we've talked a bit about today, it's not a final permanent state that we can ever fully achieve. It exists within its own becoming, one might say. And it's reliant on the continuing process of oscillation where people are willing to not only take possession of space, but also to let go of the space again and allow others to temporarily claim the space for themselves. And as such, spatial justice is, of course, very vulnerable. It only takes one person or one entity, a corporation, for instance, to be unwilling to relinquish the space to break the process. So, in addition to the explorative approach to the privatization of public space that is suggested by Garrett, and which is supported by the notion of spatial justice, I wanted to mention a more confrontational or borderline militant approach to claiming public space and problematizing the issue of public space and the right to the city. And that is the act of making it impossible for developers to make use of their property. And an example of this is Ground 69 in Copenhagen, where a youth house called Ungdomshuset used to be. Some of you might be familiar with the story. It's a quite complex story and a quite long story, and I don't have time to go into the details here, but in essence, the grounds of a communal leftist youth house was sold to a private fundamentalist Christian sect by the municipality that owned the building and the grounds that it was on. And in March 2007, the youth house was then cleared of its residents and then demolished. And as you can see in the image, this is an image of the space after it was demolished. The space was subsequently dubbed Ground 69, of course in reference to Ground Zero in New York. And it's been vacant ever since. It's still vacant today. And there are a number of reasons for this, one being that youth house activists have vowed to sabotage any development on the property and have also made good on that vow a few times, sabotaging construction equipment and so on. As long as the development on the property is said to provide a profit for the current owner, they will continue to sabotage it. In other words, there's no way, or it's very problematic to, very difficult to do anything with this piece of property for the legal owner. And this has made the property very hard to sell because the current owner is not really interested in developing it. They want to sell it on, but obviously other developers are not keen on buying a property that they might not ever be able to use. And what has happened is that instead it's opened up the space to a de facto communal use where people are planting seeds, making small gardens, doing a lot of graffiti, a lot of street art on the walls there as well. So I'm just going to do my conclusion very quickly. In relation to the theme of this panel, it seems to me that we are gradually losing the legal right to the city due to privatization. But we can still claim our moral and just right through direct action. And by doing so, perhaps we will be able to change society's mindset and focus on the sacrosanct nature of private property by emphasizing the importance of a city that is founded on the notion of spatial justice rather than on property rights.